And now we would like to begin the interview session, which will be run by our two moderators from the BA in Language and Culture program, or BALAC, Chayin Tengkanokkul, and Tamakorn Chansawang. Everyone, please give them a round of applause. So please.
All right, once again, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, Mr. McLeod, for such a wonderful telling of your own story. Once again, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Chayin Tengkanokkul.
And my name is Tamakorn Chansawang. We will lead the discussion. And I heard that this is your first time in Thailand, right?
Yeah. Yes, it is.
And what have you planned to do here? Do you have any plan to spend time in Thailand?
Yes, I actually came a few days early. I came about 4 days early so that I could just be here and get a sense of the place and the people and, of course, some sightseeing. But the book festival that I'm participating in this weekend has organized some tours starting tomorrow and some events as well. So I'm mainly here for Bangkok's first literary festival, which I hope some of you get to come out to. It's the first literary festival for Bangkok occurring this weekend. And I know the organizers have put a lot of effort into it. They've done an amazing job. And they're, I think, hoping that it becomes an annual event.
And do you have any Thai books that you are interested now? The Thai book that you are interested now?
Thai literature.
No, I was actually asking a couple. I was fortunate to have some time with 4 professors just before this event happened. And we exchanged business cards because I want to follow up with a few of them on Thai literature that's been translated into English. I greatly look forward to reading some of that work.
All right, so one more question about Thailand. So far, what has been your favorite thing about this country?
Well, that's easy to answer. It's the people.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm really flattered to hear that. So let's start our discussion, shall we? So I'd like to start with the title of your novel, so Mama Scotch. Could you explain to us the meaning of Mama Scotch and maybe some reasons of why did you choose this as your novel's title?
Right. Well, I don't usually like to give away the meaning of the title because I like people to sort of deduce it as they read the book because it is used a few times in the book. But I'll tell you there's no direct translation into English either. But I did check when I was contemplating using Mama Scotch as a title. I'm on a discussion group on Facebook with fluent Cree speakers. So I asked them, it was a word that my mother used a lot when I was a child, so it stuck with me. And she always used it when amazing things happened. Amazing things that are usually good. But anything amazing, she would say, Mama Scotch, with a sense of wonder. And so these fluent Cree speakers came back, and it wasn't simple. I got 19 different definitions of what the word meant. And it ranged from, on the one hand, how strange, to, on the other extreme, it's a miracle. And the choice of the title was difficult. I started mulling over a title as soon as I knew I had a book. As soon as I knew it was probably going to be published. And one of the titles that I came up with was The Red Madonna. We're often referred to by others as red-skinned people historically, and it's not really offensive, and we didn't mind that term. We don't like it so much anymore, but I kind of liked it growing up. In any case, I thought about using the title The Red Madonna. But then I knew that the book had to be about me. And that would have implied my mother, although a Madonna is only Madonna because she has a child. So I thought it still might work. But then I was rereading and redoing one passage where when my aunts break out of the residential school and take their younger cousins and nieces with them. At the end, when they know they're free, one of the girls says, "Mama Scotch." And when I was reviewing that passage, I thought, that's the word that I need, Mama Scotch. Yeah, and then when I had a publisher interested in the book, the first publisher who was interested told me was that they loved the title. And he had actually researched it to see if there was any other publication, poem, song, or anything with that title in the world, and there wasn't. So that made it kind of magical.
Thank you very much. Well, Mama Scotch is really catchy, really catching indeed, right? As we have read the excerpts of the first 3 chapters of the book, we couldn't help but notice that Cree is such a beautiful language. So,
Thank you.
Yes, maybe I would like you to teach us a little bit how to introduce ourselves in Cree, maybe? Yes.
Well, that's great, because that's what I usually do, and I forgot to do that today. So what I usually do is I do an introduction in Cree the way we do traditionally with each other. So we say our name, and then we say where we're from, and who our father and mother are. So to say my name, I say Darrel J. So you would say your name, and then J.
Isiagaso.
Darrel J.
So, for example, I'll say Chayin Isiagaso.
Okay.
All right.
Right.
Tamakorn isiagaso.
Right. And then the next part is Wahiao Tsinia, which means I'm from far away. And that has never been truer than today.
Yes.
So I'm from far away. Wahiao Tsinia.
Excuse me. Waiyao.
Otsi.
Otsi.
Nia.
Nia.
Nia means me.
Can you repeat it?
Wahiao.
Waiyao.
Otsi.
Osi.
Nia.
Lia.
Nia.
Nia.
Nia is me. Nihia.
I see. So thank you very much.
Thank you for asking. That's wonderful.
Thank you too.
And I would say hi. I was interested to read, I tried to do some research on Thai traditions and culture before I came. And I don't know if I read this correctly, but I think they said that there isn't actually a word for thank you in Thai as such, that it's more a nonverbal communication. Is that correct? There is a word.
Yes,
Okay.
we do have a word, but we also express our gratitude through actions as well. Yes.
Right, maybe that's what they were referring to. Because in my language, it's the same thing. I used to ask my mother, why don't we have a word? We do actually have a word, but it's been kind of in response to English to develop a word or choose a word from the language that fits the purpose. But my mother's answer to me was that we say thank you with our eyes.
Wow. Could you demonstrate a little bit? I get that now. Well, thank you so much. Very interesting indeed. So apart from English and Cree, I also heard that you speak other languages as well, such as French and Spanish, maybe? Yes.
Yes, I speak both French and Spanish. I enjoy them. I studied them, but I've spent a lot of hard hours getting fluent in both of those languages.
So many of our students here are actually participating in the language and culture program, so this might be interesting. So as someone who's multilingual, I would say, yes, how would you say that this aspect of you shapes your experiences and your perspective of the world?
Well, that's a very good question, because learning French, and particularly studying French literature, has really impacted my life. And that comes out in the book Mama Scotch. And learning Spanish has impacted my life in amazing ways too, and that comes out more in the second book, because the second book talks more about my adult life and my career. But the important way that French impacted my life, and this, like I say, this comes out in Mama Scotch, is that it was only when I started studying French literature, and they teach it entirely in French at UBC, it's like a French immersion program. They don't discuss French literature in English, they discuss French literature in French. And so you have to use your language skills. And so we were discussing a book, I think it was Manon Lescaut, and doing an analysis of this book, Manon Lescaut by l'Abbé Prévost. And I loved that book. But the professor asked me my opinion on a particular passage at one point, and this was, I think, second year university. And I told him my opinion, and he said to me, "You're a very intelligent man. Congratulations on your answer." And it was the first time a university professor had told me that I was intelligent. And I tell you, I grew 2 inches taller that day. And it totally changed my life. I started thinking, wow, if this university professor I really respected told me that he thought I was a very intelligent man, there must be something to it. So it made a huge difference. And then I struggled with a lot of my life with religion. And that comes out, of course, in the book. And I was raised Catholic, but when I was a teenager, Catholicism started not to make sense to me anymore. It didn't make sense to me anymore at the age of 14 for a number of reasons. Logically, I'm a very logical and rational person. And I mean, Catholicism will hold meaning for many people their entire lives. But for me, being logical and rational, it stopped making sense for me at about age 14. I didn't understand it. So I stopped going to the Catholic Church, but then I became a fundamentalist Christian. And friends of mine in high school converted me to Christianity. And I don't do anything halfway, and so I became quite an adamant Christian. Like I read the entire New Testament in about 2 months, and I was a fanatical Christian. But then I ran into trouble there too, because it became part of a group that was almost like a cult. And some of their teachings were a bit strange. And so I had to leave that group. And then I was kind of floundering, and I stumbled back into traditional Indigenous beliefs and an Indigenous belief system. And about the same time, I started reading the French existentialist authors. And they were talking about reason and logic, and that we should have the freedom to choose what we believe and how we want to live our lives without living in fear of going to hell or being condemned or being excommunicated. And that had so much appeal to me, that we have the freedom. We have responsibility for actions, but we have freedom. So it was the French existentialists that really helped me to move more towards my own traditional belief system.
Yeah, very interesting indeed.
Long answer, sorry everybody.
It's all right. So I hope that my peers over here have gained inspiration to continue on learning the language. Since we're discussing language matters, let's talk about the language used in the book as well. So it's mentioned in the first chapter that gendered pronouns don't exist in the Cree language. So as a Thai and English speaker, especially in Thai, gender is practiced in the level of our language. For example, we would end our sentences. If I'm a guy, I would say krap, and for girls, we say kha. So, but such features, they don't exist in Cree at all. So, apart from what you mentioned in your story, could you tell us more about the experiences, such as maybe confusions in communicating, that has resulted from this lack of gender pronouns?
Well, maybe I should talk first a bit about gender in Cree. Not only are they not pronouns, it's not binary. So some social anthropologists and sociologists have said that in many indigenous tribes in North America, they could identify from what they read from historical writings and from anthropological studies that there were up to 6 genders, in as many as 6 genders in some cultures. And so in our culture, in Cree culture, gender is quite fluid. And there's no pressure on a child to be, if they're born a male, there's no pressure for them to act in a masculine role. If they naturally tend to be more feminine, it's encouraged. And similarly for girls, if girls tend to act in a more masculine manner, that's fine. If a girl wants to join a hunting party, for example, instead of working with the food, processing food, that's totally allowable. And that was important in my family because as two of the characters in the book, one of my brothers and one of my uncles both became transgendered. And as they were growing up, they weren't dissuaded. I remember in our little town, my Uncle Danny started dressing as a girl when he was about 12. And you can imagine how bullied he was and intimidated at school. But his parents were totally fine with it, as were my cousins, my aunts and uncles. In terms of confusion, there was, as far as I understand it from my parents and my mother, the lack of those pronouns didn't lead to any confusion in the Cree language. You would deduce gender, if you needed to, from the context.
Thank you very much.
Are there any uniqueness in Cree language? Like uniqueness of the language?
Apart from the aspect of genders, is like there any other unique features that Cree language has and like, for example, our languages don't?
I don't know much about the Thai language yet, unfortunately. I wish I spoke it fluently so I could have in-depth conversations with some of you. But yes, there are unique features. The grammar is very different. For example, instead of I, you, he, she, they, first, second, and third person, we talk about people in terms of where they are physically located. So we talk about, so for example, the three of us would be one group, the people in the next row would be another group, and then the people in the distance would be another, instead of he, she, and they, that's who we'd refer to. And people who aren't here at all, people who aren't present, would be another category. So that was more important than first, second, or third person, was the actual physical positioning of people. And for me, listening to my mother growing up, it was quite frustrating because she always had to set the stage for any story she was going to tell. It was almost like she was directing a play. That's the first thing she would do, is say, your dad was sitting over there, your uncle was sitting over there, your father was sitting over there, and your grandmother was behind me, and your sisters and brothers were outside playing. And then she'd start the story. But because in our culture, a person's physical location at any point in time is more important than first, second, or third person. And the other thing is, this is a really interesting thing, is when we have a sentence, or a phrase, you always comes first when you're referring to another person. For example, to say I love you, say kisagitin, and ki is the marker for you. And so in any verb-noun combination, you always comes first before I. So it's very interesting.
It really is. Thank you. And another thing I happen to notice that just recently the trend of the singular they has been really rising. So I would like to hear your thoughts as someone who comes from a language that I would say has that for like a while ago already. Yes. May I hear your opinion on it?
Well, there's a huge, a groundswell of transition in relation to transgender issues. There are issues coming out that weren't prevalent when my brother/sister and uncle/aunt were going through the process. There's more transgender issues being discussed generally, and people are more open about it, and there's more academic discussions, there's all kinds of activity going on in relation to being transgendered. I personally, having grown up, having to be in that environment with transgendered people from a very young age, think that at least in Canada, people are over politicizing it, which is making it more difficult for everybody. And I said this actually, I was at a session speaking on a panel in Victoria about a year ago, and there was a transgendered person on the panel, and there was a transgendered person in the audience, and they were so angry, and they felt they had been victimized so incredibly by society, by men in particular, and they were going on and on and on, and not just them, but everybody in the audience debating the issues. And I said, in my culture there were up to 6 genders recognized, and it was never an issue. And so I don't think it really needs to be an issue. Right now, unfortunately, it's being over-politicized, and I think people are getting too polarized as a result. And there's way too much anger and hostility on all sides, I think, about the issue.
But do you have like any concept that if the language have 6 genders, like is there any concept that relate to that types of gender? Like for example, in Thai, a girl have to say really like politely in manner. Like if the boy say more less impolite, it's okay to be that way. Yeah, like in Cree language. Yeah, do you have any like concept of gender?
Right. Well, I think the lack of pronouns was very revealing because that kind of carries over into other aspects of the culture as well. So in terms of behavior, if a girl or woman wants to behave in a more masculine way, there's no problem. And similarly, if a boy or man wants to behave in a more feminine way, there's no issue. It's absolutely not a problem. So I think in language, we just get too caught up in the details and the workings. I look forward to seeing where the whole issue settles in the end. For example, I know that based on my experience that I'm doing some things when I speak about transgender issues that are definitely no-nos, like what I just did, referring to my brother as my brother/sister. But unfortunately, if that offends anybody, I'm really sorry, but that's my reality. Because I had a brother for 18 years, and I had a sister for another 10 years after that. And that person wasn't, both of those people were embodied in that one person. And I think I'm doing an injustice to my brother of 18 years if I just say she, or if I just refer to him. But it's an absolute no-no with the transgender community right now to do that.
Okay. And so it's clear that language can affect your perspective or your worldview. So like I have a question from the excerpt in the book. Like in the book it says that she is your mother see the world differently from the way they teach us in school. Yeah. Rocks are alive. She's called them our grandfathers. Could you explain this sentence to me?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in some languages, and I don't know about Thai language, but in French and Spanish, for example, we have masculine and feminine, right? And there doesn't seem to be any logic to it. For example, a chair, une chaise, in French is feminine. Is it because it has 4 legs? I don't know. There's no rhyme or reason, and it isn't consistent. I thought when I was studying French and Spanish that there would be some consistency. So if an object was feminine in French, I thought it would be also feminine in Spanish, and that isn't the case. But because they're both Romance languages, I thought that would be the case. But I think the biggest thing that I was talking about there, and it's another important grammatical difference or structural difference with Cree, we don't have masculine and feminine. We have animate and inanimate objects. And it's surprising what is animate and what's inanimate. So rocks are animate objects. They're considered to be alive. And rocks for us, because they embody, because rocks are ancient, we call them our grandfathers. And animate and inanimate are replaced or are masculine, feminine, for example.
And okay, thank you. And before I read your book, I have to accept that I never heard the word First Nation before. So, as a role as a chief negotiator, land claims, and an executive director of education and international affairs with the Assembly of First Nation, can you tell me more about your work experience? Like,
Well, how much time do we have? Being a land claims negotiator was one of the best jobs that I ever had. Partly because it was incredibly challenging. We had to deal with every issue that affects people's lives. So we were dealing with ownership of lands and resources, ownership of forestry resources, ownership of fisheries, dealing of governance, self-government, so people having control over their own affairs, like education, health, social services, community infrastructure, funding, management. So it was an incredibly complex job. And I had to work with a team of experts and a group of lawyers all the time, so I was challenged every day. And I loved that. But it was such an incredible opportunity to make a difference in people's lives that when I was offered the job, but when they asked me to apply for the job, at first I said no, because I would have been working for the federal government, and many Indigenous people would have seen me as a betrayer, seen that as a betrayal. But I knew in my heart, when I saw the job description, I knew in my heart it was an opportunity to make a difference. And it was probably the most difficult job I've done. And the most difficult thing was convincing my counterparts in Ottawa, working for the federal government, that they should approve what we had negotiated. That was very difficult to do. We were successful, but it was very hard work. Then when I worked with the Assembly of First Nations, I was working with a very progressive national chief. His name was Phil Fontaine. And it was a time when the government of the day, which was a liberal government under a prime minister named Paul Martin. This is all in my second book, by the way. Paul Martin was very friendly to the national chief and very cooperative. There was a good deal of collaboration and cooperation. So they were heady days, really amazing days. So in education, for example, I was able to work on a process called the Kelowna Accord, where the federal government had chosen 5 key areas where they're going to improve the lives of Indigenous people in Canada. And one of those key areas was education. So I was the executive director in charge of that negotiation. And so I got to work with, I was working with a committee of chiefs from around the country, and we were sitting across the table from provincial bureaucrats and federal bureaucrats and negotiating a new arrangement for education. And we did it. I mean, it took 3 years, but we got to the point where we had a deal. And then unfortunately the government changed and they killed the deal, except for one aspect, which was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I spoke of earlier. But the other part of my job with the Assembly of First Nations was international relations. And with that job, I got to work on an important piece of work called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's a declaration that was in its final stages when I became involved, but I was the head of the Assembly of First Nations delegation to the UN in the final stages of the negotiation of that. And unfortunately, the government changed just before that declaration went to a vote. And a new conservative government came into power, and they basically pulled the rug out from under the feet of the Assembly of First Nations, and everything was kind of thrown up in the air. And then, unfortunately, the government of Canada voted against the UN declaration, one of 4 countries, but they've now turned that around. They realized after a series of briefings from lawyers and policy analysts and experts in the field that they actually were better to accept the declaration and be on side with it. So that was amazing. And also in that role, I got to lead organize a major conference in Buenos Aires, Argentina. So I got to travel to Buenos Aires about 7 times within a couple of years. And I had the honor of putting together a major conference of about 800 participants of Indigenous leaders from all over the Americas. And then we took a group of about 18 chiefs to meet with the ministers of foreign affairs from all the member countries of the Organization of American States. And it was wonderful. It was a historic moment that's never happened again since.
So like as a teacher, why do you feel like it is important to learn our ancestor history? Like why is it important to learn history? Yeah.
To learn history?
Yeah.
Well, I forget who said this, but there's a saying that people who don't learn history are more likely to repeat it, particularly the bad things in history. And I think it's really important to learn from our mistakes as a race. And there have been plenty, so that we don't repeat them and that we move forward into a more progressive and cooperative society.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I heard many issue about the indigenous people. Like there are many problems that happen now. Do you have any opinions regarding this issue?
I certainly do. Lots of opinions about current issues. I think we're at a place where, just in my lifetime, in my career has been about, let's say over a period of 25 years, have improved incredibly in the lives of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And there are statistics to measure that. For example, education completion rates, the number of high school graduates, the number of university graduates. So just to give you a really brief snapshot, I worked in the post-secondary system for a number of years in British Columbia. And in that role, I used to get invited to graduations of universities, like this university. And it was wonderful to get to go to these graduation ceremonies. So when I first started doing that and went to graduation, there would be graduates, there would be maybe 20 teachers graduating from an institution like the University of British Columbia. And there might be 1 lawyer, no medical doctors, no graduates in any of the scientific fields, maybe 1 or 2 master's students. So that would have been like in 1990. And if you fast forward to like 2015, at a graduation ceremony at the same university, there would be 10 medical doctors graduating or more, maybe 30 lawyers, probably 50 teachers, probably about 20 PhDs, probably about 50 people at the master's level, and so on. A few foresters, a few fisheries experts. So the transition just in the span of my career, not my lifetime, but just the span of my career, the transition is amazing. And of course, those people are going back to their communities. So whereas it used to be impossible to find a medical doctor in Canada who was Indigenous, now there's a good likelihood that you could find an Indigenous medical doctor. The lawyers, the Indigenous lawyers out there practicing are really changing the landscape. Authors, in the arts, there's been this revolution in visual arts, in music, and in literature that's been absolutely amazing. It's wonderful. I'm just one of a cadre of new voices in the literary landscape for Indigenous authors in Canada. So things are improving. Of course, they could improve more quickly. We, unfortunately, in Canada, it's well known that we still have poverty. We still have problems with clean drinking water. There are some communities who don't have access to clean drinking water still. There are some communities who still live in abject poverty in the north, in isolated communities. And fortunately, the current government has made commitments to address those issues and to address them quickly and in a very meaningful way. And I'm very encouraged by that. And I think we will see more action. Like I mentioned earlier, we have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, and they came out with, I can't remember how many recommendations, over 100, I think 160 recommendations. And the government is committed to implementing their recommendations as quickly and as much as they can. So I'm very encouraged by that. And our current Prime Minister was the first Prime Minister in my lifetime that mentioned Indigenous issues on the campaign trail. And then in his victory speech, the night he won the election, he mentioned Indigenous issues, and that's the first time I've ever heard that. So that's a really good sign.
So, thank you very much for such a deep and colorful insight that you've given us today. We really appreciate it. Unfortunately, our time for our discussion right now is over. So now we'd like to begin our question and answer session from the floor.
Great.
Yes. So if you have any questions or if you have anything to share, you're welcome to do so now. And we're open to questions both in English and in Thai, as we will be translating them if they're Thai. So,
Or French or Spanish.
Exacto.
So any of you has any questions, you can raise your hands and we'll hand you the microphone. Yeah.
Right. An example is, she asked about the difference between animate and inanimate. So, for example, a rock is considered animate because it's full of life. And we use rocks in our ceremonies. We heat the rock until it's red, and then we use that to create steam, for example, in a sweat lodge ceremony. Off the top of my head, I can't think of examples of inanimate objects, but I mean, I have studied lists, and it's surprising to me what is animate and what's inanimate. But things have life, just from a cultural perspective, things that are considered not to have life in our culture.
In connection to that, when you were talking about the residential school generation, how is it that after such a long absence from the culture, and it's a very sudden and clean cut, how is it that they reconnected with the old people? Do a lot of people become white and internalized and not return to Cree culture, or pretty much everybody comes back home and begin to relearn?
Well, I would say there's a range. So some people were fortunate to go home every summer, and were fortunate enough to maintain strong ties with their community and their culture and language. I'd say they're a minority of attendees. At the other extreme, I've met people who were away for 10 years without ever going home. And yes, they did feel very isolated from their culture and language. And it's important to remember that this didn't happen just to one generation. In most communities, it happened at least for 3 generations. For some communities, it happened like 4 or 5 generations, so there's a cumulative effect. And in communities where I've worked in, the culture has been disrupted. Even if the language is still alive to some extent, things like parenting patterns and relationship patterns and the bond was broken, and it's very, very difficult to get back. So there are, and more people, because there's more publicity and more awareness of Indigenous issues, people who have been isolated and far away from the culture or from their families and their background, more and more kind of trying to find their way back, and are doing it successfully, and are are finding a good degree of acceptance when they come back. There's often, I'd say, almost monthly stories in the Canadian newspaper about some type of reunification that's happened. and it's really encouraging. But it wasn't easy. It was very difficult for children who had been separated from their families and culture to find their way back to the culture. It's incredibly difficult. There are a whole bunch of dynamics that play out because when a person has been removed from their culture for a good length of time and they come back, they behave differently, they speak differently, and the people they're coming back to don't always understand why. And so there can be problems with acceptance. And I had that problem myself, for example, because I was removed from my community when I was 10. And luckily I was taken care of by my older sister and her husband. But her husband taught me to speak English differently. I used to have an accent, the same accent that all of my aunts and uncles and cousins have, or had. And so when I would go home, I would speak English differently, and I would stand out. And it was, although my cousins knew me because, like I said, we were like sisters and brothers up until age 10, so they didn't reject me because I was different, but they made me aware that I was different. And that in itself made things a bit difficult for me.
A couple more things. I'm just so curious. About the return and connecting. You didn't talk a lot about food in your speech, but I imagine also because the environment has changed a lot, so that whatever food making or because of displacement, whatever that was in the culture and how you made food or have you planted, or it's an ecological thing. That might not come back, or that can't be reproduced. And the other thing is, I wonder if there is an attempt in the First Nations communities to make recordings, because the languages and the storytelling or the songs or chants are so, the oral culture of it really depends on hearing, and we have technology now. Before YouTube or before technology, it might be hard to make those kinds of recordings, but now we do have video and things like that. If there's an attempt to at least record some of the old people telling as many stories as they can still remember, and sort of keep some of that heritage before they go away. I wonder if there's an attempt to do that.
Well, in relation to the food, traditional diet is very important to us, and luckily it's one of the things that's still strong. Although with the advent of residential schools and colonization, our diet changed, and it's had a serious impact on the health of Indigenous people. So there's an epidemic of diabetes, for example, which is happening in many countries of the world where there's been an experience of colonization. And in response to that, and an epidemic of obesity as well, a lot of communities are responding by going back to a traditional diet. For example, there's, just in my family, a very specific example. We used to gather all of the berries that we could. There were like maybe 7 different kinds of berries, starting with the gooseberries in the spring, and the last berry we would pick, there would be strawberries, blueberries, huckleberries, Saskatoon berries, and then in the late fall we would pick cranberries and high bush cranberries. And it turns out that cranberries and high bush cranberries are very good at helping to control insulin levels. But nobody knew that until like about the last 10 years. So my cousins have started harvesting those berries again to help get their diabetes situation under control. And there are communities that have worked with dietitians and doctors, medical doctors, to turn their diet around and get back to a traditional diet. By the way, is very close to the keto diet, which in North America, I don't know if it's popular here, but the keto diet is very popular in North America, and it's our diet, our traditional diet is very much like the keto diet. And with regards to language preservation, most of the Indigenous languages in Canada are endangered including mine, which is Cree. Although Cree is one of the languages that apparently has the greatest chance of survival because it still has so many fluent speakers, and they're not all elders. And there are efforts to record the language. There are all kinds of efforts to document the language. I'm encouraged by the things that I see each day. And just yesterday I saw, I think it was on Facebook, that there's an online Cree course that's being developed right now for my particular, there are 5 dialects of Cree. And for my dialect, there's an online Cree course coming up that you can sign on to and take any time. So I'm really excited about that. And there's some immersion programs coming up for kids and for adults. So there are certainly good efforts being made. But, and there's a new initiative by the Government of Canada there used to be an initiative and it was taken away, and now there's a new funding initiative for Indigenous languages that will help as well. But it's in a desperate situation. And, I like to make the point with people who may not understand that, there are people who are second or third generation immigrants to Canada from other countries, like, let's say, from Italy or Germany or India, and they're sad that their children or grandchildren are not speaking their languages. But guess what? They have a homeland that, if they want to learn the language, and there are lots of resources out there, it's be possible for them to recover their language. But with our languages, that isn't the case. If Cree dies, it's gone. Like if it dies in Canada, it's gone forever. And the same with all the other Indigenous languages. And they truly are endangered. Just in my case alone, my mother and father, all of my aunts and uncles and cousins over 60 were all fluent speakers, and it was their language of choice whenever they could speak it. So you take that generation, then you look at my generation, and I can carry out a simple conversation. There are speakers, fluent speakers, but not many. Maybe 10% of Cree people my age would speak our language. And you look at the next generation, my nieces and nephews, they don't speak at all. So it's just taken between my mother's generation and her grandchildren for the language to be lost.
Hello, my name is Kama, and it's lovely to meet you, Darrel. I'm also from Alberta, and I'm really grateful for this tonight. I was feeling very homesick actually this morning, and then I saw this on Facebook, so I rushed here from work, so I'm very, very grateful. I have a question for you. Actually, I'm seeking your advice. So as a non-Indigenous Canadian, as we take this journey on truth and reconciliation, what questions, let's say, what are 3 questions that I need to be asking my elected officials as we take this journey?
Well, that's a wonderful question, particularly after a hard-won election by the Liberal Party, a very problematic election in Canada. We, as you know, have a minority government now, which I think is actually not a bad thing, but we had the leader of the opposition, Andrew Scheer, who has 12 First Nations in his community, and he didn't say what he was going to do for them or advance Indigenous issues in any way at all. So I don't know what he or other MPs are doing to truly represent all of their constituents. So I think that would be one of the first questions we could ask our MPs is, first of all, do you know who the First Nations are in your riding? And if you do, have you met with them, and what are you doing to advance their situation as you would any other group, minority group in your constituency? So do you know who they are? What are you doing to advance their quality of life? How are you helping them? How are you supporting them? And then on a broader scale, what are they doing to advance the plight of Indigenous people in Canada and to foster reconciliation, to help other non-Indigenous Canadians understand the situation, the reality? Unfortunately, and I worked for government for years, so I'm not beating up on the government by any stretch at all. But unfortunately, successive governments For years and years and years, all they would say about Indigenous people is how much money they were spending on them. And to the general public, without any context, if you say, oh, we spent $5 billion on Indigenous people last year, and the general public go, holy moly, that's a lot of money. But they don't say that that was to cover the basics, and that it's still a lower level of funding for things like education, child and family services, healthcare than they spend on your average Canadian. And they don't compare it for Northerners, for example, a comparison that would have meaning. So the question I would ask them, I guess this would be the third one, is what are they doing to help educate the general non-Indigenous population about Indigenous people and Indigenous rights in Canada?
So can we now have one last question? I see the lady over there.
I'd like you to share a little more when you mentioned about the classification of gender fluidity in Cree culture. When you mentioned that the Indigenous people of Canada is more like acceptance, and they are more tendency towards tolerance for gender fluidity within the community. Could you share a little more? What if one go beyond that classification of the 6 terms that you mentioned before earlier? Are there consequences? Are there marginalization of the people?
Well, the answer to that question is very complex because traditionally and historically, that was our cultural way of thinking. And there have been Indigenous anthropologists, and there's even been two-spirited Indigenous anthropologists who've studied the issue and have written books on that theme, on that topic. And that level of acceptance was historical, and I do describe that a bit in my book. So that for my grandparents and aunts and uncles, they supported my brother and uncle in their transition and in their whole process, and stood by them to the end. However, cousins my age and younger were not supportive, and they were indoctrinated by Christianity and bought into the Judeo-Christian belief system of what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong. And so that level of acceptance that there was in traditional societies has been diminished. And unfortunately, in a lot of our communities in Canada, what I've seen is a high degree there's a lot of homophobia, which is not our way. It isn't part of our traditional belief system. But people have bought into Western values and the Western way of thinking. So in the current reality, it isn't easy for anybody who's different in a small Indigenous community in Canada, or even in an urban environment. I was shocked even when I was working at a place like the Assembly of First Nations with the homophobic slurs that would come out of people's mouths. And I think, and I'll say this, that I think Indigenous leaders in Canada need to take a serious look at this issue. And there's a specific reason that I say that. There's an epidemic of youth suicide in Indigenous communities in Canada. And from my experience working and living in Indigenous communities, a lot of the Indigenous youth are committing suicide because of issues of fear of it being found out that they're having issues with sexual preference. They're not clear about sexual preference, or they know that they're gay, lesbian, or want to be transsexual, and they're being ostracized or bullied. So that issue definitely needs to be addressed. I think a lot of these young people are committing suicide because of their confusion and the way they're treated around those issues in their communities. So the traditional way was much healthier, and we're slowly coming back to it in regards to gender identity and sexual preference as well, thankfully. But it's a long haul.
So that was our last question for our Q&A session. So once again, us as the moderators of this discussion, we'd like to thank you again so much for this deep and colorful discussion we had. So I would like to give the floor back to our masters of ceremony here. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
McLeod, and our two moderators, and also our audience as well for asking such interesting questions and an insightful talk as well. So Mama Scotch, A Cree Coming of Age, is indeed a priceless piece of writing. The stories, which include Mr. McLeod's collective traumas, struggles, his journey to overcome those things, and also his reconciliation with his relatives, are heartbreaking yet heartwarming. So I think it is definitely a book worth reading once in our lives.
So yes, once again, Mr. Darrel J. McLeod, we have to thank you for being here tonight and give us such an insightful interview, and also your lecture as well. And we also have to thank the Embassy of Canada for making this event possible. And last but not least, we have to thank you guys, our lovely audience, for being here with us tonight. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts, Chulalongkorn University, we bid you farewell and a safe journey home. ขอบคุณค่ะ